my presentation today is actually going to end with exactly the theme of your talk, which is collective action in order to make decisions in a crisis situation. So that's exactly where my presentation is going. So what I'm going to talk about is globalization and what lies ahead. But really what I'm going to talk about in the next 12 minutes is global supply chains, globalization, the Canadian economy, where are we going? But before I do that, I'm going to take you back 600 years. So to think about globalization, let's go back to the year 1500. And if you look at this slide, if you look at this slide back to 1500, what you can see is how open was the global economy. If you look at the global economy, there was trade for centuries, we know that, but trade really picked up only after the mid 1800s. So if you look at 1850, openness, which is defined as trade relative to GDP, that was only at about 5%. And then you see by the eve of World War I, you see trade has really gone up to about 30%. So trade relative to GDP or openness goes all the way to 30%. So then you see the big collapse that happens as a result of World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And once we come out at the bottom at the end of World War II, you see that openness to trade is really around 10%, almost what it was 200 years before. And then after World War II, what we really see is a surge in globalization. And so the reason this picture is so important is that in the post-World War II period, the growth that we've seen in globalization is really unprecedented in history. And what really underlies this growth in globalization is the international rules-based system that emerged after World War II. So after World War II, what we have is the emergence of these four multilateral institutions: the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, the WTO, which really regulate cooperation within the global economic and political order. So the IMF is really focused on stabilizing world financial systems and helping countries manage current account crises. The UN is doing incredible things on the political side, but their sustainable development goals and eliminating extreme poverty by the year 2030, an incredibly important goal for many, many reasons, and the role of globalization in that. The World Bank, the work that I've done with the World Bank, looks at bringing capital into developing countries to develop their infrastructure, because in the absence of infrastructure, it's very difficult for countries to escape poverty. But most relevant for the current talk is the World Trade Organization, which really sets the rules for the international rules-based order. And I think it's really important to note right now that in 2012, the EU, the European Union, got the Nobel Peace Prize, not the Nobel Prize in economics, they got the Nobel Peace Prize. And to read from the statement at the time, for over 6 decades, the EU contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy, and human rights in Europe. So not only does globalization deliver lots of economic benefits, billions of people have been taken out of poverty as a result of globalization. There's also many political benefits that come from that. And this is not without controversy, but countries that trade with one another tend not to fight with one another. But even that comes with some controversy. So let's bring it to the modern context, where we are today. If you look at globalization and just the surge in globalization and the amount of wealth that this has created for the global economy, it's unbelievable. On the eve of the global financial crisis in 2008, there's a big reduction in globalization. But what you see in the aftermath is globalization is slowing or falling. And this has given rise, or this is a reflection of populism and protectionism. Now, I think it's very important to make the following point. When countries engage in international trade and globalization, when Canada and the United States engage in trade with countries like China and India, each country is made better off. Each country benefits from engaging in the global economy. But within each country, there are people that win and people that lose. And in the Canadian context, the Canadian government has done a very good job at helping those people who have been displaced as a result of globalization. So in Canada, and the Canadian government has been complimented for this, there hasn't been a real rise in populism and push for protectionism. In contrast, the US has done the absolute least to help people who have been displaced as a result of globalization. So when you think about the US, there's all of what's called the Rust Belt: Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all of these states that were doing incredibly well in the 60s and the 70s, the manufacturing hub of the world. And then what happens? There's all of this globalization that happens, and all of these jobs leave these states and they go to places like China, India, and other emerging markets in Southeast Asia and Latin America. The fact that the US benefited significantly, from globalization, people in the Rust Belt, it doesn't matter to them. They say, we lost our livelihoods. So when someone like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson in the UK come along and say, we're going to tear down the international trading system, tear down trade agreements, that resonates with a lot of these people that have not benefited from globalization. Now, what's incredibly important is a book written by Ed Luce from the Financial Times. He wrote a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And there he talks about this thing called the snapback provision, the snapback. Many people thought that somehow once there was another election in the US, there would be a Democratic president and things would snap back to the way they were before. And he provides convincing evidence that that's not the case. That's definitely not the case, that there will be no snapback. The narrative globally has moved away from globalization, and this has been reinforced in the current environment of the pandemic, when we couldn't get access to really important PPE and ventilators and medical equipment. So in the Canadian context, Canada's progressive trade agenda, which is really advanced by Prime Minister Trudeau and the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, the idea there is trade has to be more inclusive. We have to ensure that racialized and marginalized communities benefit from trade, that large and small companies benefit from trade, that males and females benefit from trade, that Canada's First Nations and Indigenous communities benefit from trade. So Canada's progressive trade agenda is an explicit attempt on the part of the Canadian government to try to mitigate the likelihood of populism and protectionism coming into the Canadian marketplace. When you look at Canada's trade, here's the big challenge that we have as a country. 76% of our exports go to one country, that being the United States. And look how vulnerable we were when the US government threatened to tear down the NAFTA agreement. So if they were to tear down the NAFTA agreement, that would be the prosperity of 10 million Canadians. So Canada really needs to diversify our global footprint away from the US. So 76% of our exports aren't in the US. Here's the problem that Canada finds itself in, and other middle powers like Canada, is that both China and the United States are undermining the world's rules-based institutions. The United States has left the Paris Accords. They left the World Health Organization. They're blocking the appointment of judges to the World Trade Organization, so they can't make rulings on fair or unfair trade complaints. China is subsidizing its companies. So both China and the US are undermining the world's rules-based trading system. So the middle powers, which include Canada, need to deal with this. And there's something called the Ottawa Group, which is an attempt. But the issue here is, this is a problem for Canada. Now that the US has a new administration, will the US go back to the way it was before? Time will tell, but there's little evidence to show that China will. So we've all heard about the impact of the pandemic on the economy and what's the shape of the recovery going to be. Is it going to be a V-shaped recovery? Is it going to be a U-shaped? The idea initially was there was nothing wrong with the economy and it was closed down for some reason that was not economic. But because it's taken so long to get access, to get the virus under control, and there's a second wave, and now we have a vaccine, but even the EU is talking about limiting exports of vaccines unless the European countries themselves get their fair share. So how long is it going to take to recover? The most optimistic estimates are that we will not recover, Canada will not recover, and the global economy will not recover to pre-pandemic levels for at least 2 years. So we're going to be into 2022 or 2023. But this picture on the right is most concerning because this picture on the right is the one that talks about a K-shaped recovery. So this is unlike all of the ones on the left where the U-shaped and the V and the W and the swish, all of these. This is one that's most concerning because we have a whole group in society that are doing really, really well. Most of us watching would be in this group doing relatively well. But there's a whole nother group that are in industries that have not recovered, and these people are not doing really well. And I'm actually involved in a community survey. I'm one of the lead authors, and we're looking at what's the impact being on racialized and marginalized communities. Many people are very negatively affected, not just financially, but mentally as well. Governments need to make sure that these people are not left behind, a very important challenge. So in the middle of the pandemic, so much emotion, and rightfully so. People felt helpless, governments felt helpless. Doctors were being, heart-wrenching stories of doctors having to decide whether to put someone on a ventilator or not because there was a shortage of ventilators. And who took the heat for that were global supply chains, okay? But when you look at global supply chains and just look at the reaction over the last year, and ventilator production in the US has responded, it's increased dramatically. Even countries like Toyota and the big automakers have repurposed their production facilities in order to produce badly needed PPE and other medical equipment. Now masks are relatively easy to get and so on. So what is the upshot of what I'm talking about here? This is a once in a century event. So global supply chains and globalization have been heavily criticized because of those shortages. There was a lot of emotion, but global supply chains are here to stay. What we need to do is mitigate the downsides of globalization, and these are policy failures. These are not failures that result from globalization itself. So building resilience in global supply chains for critical medical equipment is wise. Dismantling global supply chains is not wise. And that's how I'll stop my talk. Thank you very much.